The silence that felt like love. Sandra Bullock had learned over the years that silence could be louder than applause. On a quiet morning in Los Angeles, long before the city fully woke, she sat near a wide window with a cup of coffee cooling untouched in her hands. The sun was still low, spilling a pale gold light across the floor, soft enough to feel like a memory rather than a moment. Outside, the city moved slowly, cars whispering past, palm trees swaying as if they were keeping secrets. This was the hour she liked most, when the world hadn't started demanding anything from her yet. And in these quiet hours, her thoughts almost always drifted to the same place, to the same name. Keanu Reeves. Not the legend, not the man whose face appeared on billboards and screens around the world, but the man who had once sat beside her in silence and made that silence feel safe. For decades, people had asked the same question, sometimes gently, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with disbelief. Why didn't you and Keanu ever get married? The world loved the idea of them together. Fans had written stories, headlines had hinted at hidden romances, interviewers had leaned forward in their chairs, waiting for a confession that never came. To everyone else, it looked like a love story that had stopped just before the ending. But to Sandra, it was something else entirely. It wasn't unfinished. It simply lived in a place that didn't need to be explained. She took a slow sip of her coffee and stared out the window, remembering how it all began, not with fireworks or drama, but with something far quieter. They met in the early 1990s, both standing at the edge of careers that were just beginning to take shape. Hollywood was loud then, relentless and hungry, always asking for more charm, more confidence, more noise. Sandra arrived on set with energy that filled every room, her laughter quick and bright, her confidence almost theatrical. It was armor, though she didn't fully realize it at the time. Beneath it lived a young woman still figuring out who she was, still learning how to survive in a world that watched too closely. Keanu was different. From the very first day, she noticed it. He didn't push himself forward. He didn't compete for attention. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. There was a calmness to him that felt out of place in Hollywood, like a deep breath in a crowded room. Between takes, they'd sit together, sharing coffee, watching the crew rush around them. Conversations came easily, then stopped just as easily, slipping into comfortable quiet. Sandra had always felt the need to fill silence, to turn it into jokes or stories, but with Keanu, she didn't feel that pressure. He didn't seem to need noise to connect. And slowly, without either of them naming it, something settled between them, a sense of understanding that felt rare and fragile. They became friends first, deeply and sincerely. They talked about films, about the strange rhythm of fame, about the weight of expectations. Sometimes they talked about nothing at all. Late at night, they'd drive through the city, streetlights flashing past like passing thoughts, the radio low, the world outside blurred and distant. Those moments didn't feel like romance. They felt like rest. Sandra didn't know then how much she needed that. She only knew that when she was with him, her shoulders relaxed in a way they never did anywhere else. Keanu, in turn, saw past her humor and charm. He noticed how her laughter sometimes came a second too fast, how she smiled even when something in her eyes hinted at exhaustion. He recognized it because he carried his own quiet grief, his own losses, carefully folded and rarely shared. Hollywood expected something more dramatic from them. It always does. Two attractive actors, undeniable chemistry, the perfect recipe for headlines. But what they shared refused to fit neatly into those expectations. There were no secret affairs, no explosive confessions, no messy breakups. Just a bond that grew slowly, almost invisibly, strengthened by time rather than passion. Once, during a late evening on set, Sandra asked him why he was so quiet. He smiled gently, the kind of smile that didn't try to charm anyone. "Sometimes," he said, "quiet is the only place where things feel real." She laughed then, but the words stayed with her. Years passed. Their careers soared. They worked on different films, traveled to different countries, built lives that looked full from the outside. But whenever life grew heavy, when relationships ended, when expectations felt overwhelming, somehow Keanu was always there. Sometimes it was just a text message. "You okay?" Nothing dramatic, nothing intrusive, just a reminder that someone saw her. There was one night she never forgot. The rain had been relentless, pounding against the windows of her apartment, the city outside blurred by water and light. She just learned that a relationship she'd believed in had ended, not with anger or betrayal, but with the quiet realization that it wasn't enough. She sat on the floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes and thoughts she couldn't organize. She didn't want to call anyone. She didn't want sympathy or advice. But her hand moved on its own. dialing a number she knew by heart. Keanu answered immediately. She didn't explain, she didn't need to. An hour later, there was a knock at her door. He stood there, soaked from the rain, hair damp, eyes steady. He didn't bring flowers, he didn't offer solutions. He simply sat beside her, close enough to feel real, quiet enough to let her breathe again. That night, she realized something she never said out loud. He was the only person who had never asked anything of her. Not affection, not reassurance, not love in return. He simply showed up. As time went on, their conversations grew more reflective. Life had a way of softening people, of stripping away what didn't matter. Keanu faced losses that carved deep, silent spaces into his life. Sandra faced her own heartbreaks and doubts. They didn't always talk about these things directly, but they didn't need to. There was a shared understanding that didn't require explanation. People assumed that if two people cared this deeply, marriage must have been the obvious next step. But love doesn't always move in straight lines. For Sandra and Keanu, there was an unspoken agreement, one built on respect and fear in equal measure. Fear not of commitment, but of loss, of risking something rare by trying to turn it into something ordinary. Years later, they met at a small cafe tucked away from the noise of the city. It wasn't planned. It never needed to be. Time seemed to slow as they sat across from each other, coffee steaming between them, the world outside moving on without notice. "People still ask," Sandra said softly, stirring her cup without looking up, "why we never got married." Keanu smiled faintly. "And what do you tell them?" She met his eyes, and for a moment the years disappeared. That not every love story needs an ending. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, heavy with everything they had never spoken. But beneath that calm lived a truth neither had ever fully faced. There was a reason they never crossed that line, not because they didn't love each other, but because their love existed in a place untouched by expectations, by ownership, by fear of losing control. Unbeknownst to Sandra, Keanu once wrote her a letter. He never sent it. It stayed folded inside an old script, words pressed into paper with care and restraint. In it, he wrote that love wasn't just about finding the right person, it was about timing. That maybe they met too early, or maybe they met exactly when they were supposed to, just not in the way the world understands. He wrote that she had been his peace in a noisy world. Years later, when Sandra came across that letter by accident, she cried, not because of what it said, but because she had written something similar once. A letter of her own, never mailed, filled with words she'd been too careful to release. Some loves live not in what we do, but in what we choose not to do, in the spaces we protect, in the silence we honor. That morning by the window, Sandra set her coffee down and let the memories settle. She felt no regret, only gratitude. The world might call their story unfinished, but she knew better. Some stories don't end. They continue quietly in kindness, in presence, in a love that never demanded to be named. And somewhere under the same sky, Keanu was likely waking to the same light, carrying the same quiet knowledge, that the love they never spoke of was the one that lasted beyond time. When silence began to speak, Sandra Bullock had always believed that time softened memories, that distance made emotions quieter, easier to manage. But as the years unfolded, she discovered something unexpected. Time didn't weaken what she felt for Keanu Reeves. It clarified it, like fog lifting slowly from a familiar road, revealing not something new, but something that had always been there. The world around her kept changing, new films, new faces, new phases of life. But that steady presence, that quiet understanding, remained untouched by years or circumstance. After the cafe conversation, something shifted between them. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, like a door left slightly open after being closed for too long. They didn't suddenly become inseparable, nor did they confess anything dramatic. Instead, they began to speak a little more honestly, to linger a little longer in conversations, to let silence stretch without immediately pulling away from it. It was as if both of them sensed that they were standing at the edge of something fragile, something that could either deepen or disappear depending on how carefully it was handled. Their calls became more frequent, often late at night when the world felt quieter and safer. Sometimes they talked about trivial things, books he was reading, a role she was unsure about, a restaurant he'd discovered while traveling. Other times, the conversations drifted into memories neither had visited in years. They spoke about the early days, about how strange and overwhelming fame had felt, about moments of doubt they had never shared with anyone else. What made these conversations different wasn't the content, but the absence of performance. With him, Sandra didn't have to be strong. With her, Keanu didn't have to be composed. There was one call that stayed with her long after it ended. It was late, past midnight, the city outside her window glowing softly. Keanu's voice came through calm as always, but something about it felt heavier. He spoke about loss, not directly, not dramatically, but in fragments. About how grief doesn't always arrive loudly, how sometimes it settles quietly into everyday life, showing up in empty rooms or unfinished sentences. Sandra listened without interrupting, her heart aching in recognition. When he stopped speaking, she didn't rush to respond. She simply stayed there, breathing with him through the phone. That silence felt like the most honest thing either of them had offered in years. In those moments, Sandra began to understand something she had avoided for a long time. What they shared wasn't absence of love, it was restraint. They had both been protecting something delicate, something they were afraid to break by naming it. Hollywood relationships burned fast and faded faster. They had seen it happen too many times. Perhaps without ever agreeing to it aloud, they had chosen a different path, one that valued presence over possession. They met again months later, unexpectedly, at a charity event far from the noise of premieres and flashing cameras. The setting was simple, understated, filled with people who cared more about purpose than attention. When Sandra walked in and saw Keanu standing near the edge of the room, speaking quietly to someone, she felt that familiar calm wash over her. Not excitement, not anxiety, just recognition. When their eyes met, there was no surprise, only warmth. They spent most of that evening side by side, not clinging to each other, not drawing attention, just existing in the same space. Their conversations were easy, punctuated by laughter and thoughtful pauses. At one point, as music played softly in the background, Sandra caught herself watching him instead of listening. The way he listened so intently to others, the way he carried kindness without ever announcing it. It struck her then how rare that was, how rare he was. Later, outside under the soft glow of streetlights, she finally voiced something that had lived inside her for years. Not a confession, but a question. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "if we chose the easy way by staying friends?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky, thoughtful, as if weighing not just her words, but everything behind them. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I think we chose the honest way," he said. "Easy would have been pretending we felt nothing, or rushing into something because everyone expected it." His answer stayed with her long after they parted that night. Honest. That word carried weight. It suggested that what they had wasn't avoidance but intention, that love didn't always have to be loud to be real. As time moved forward, Sandra found herself facing a familiar pattern in her own life. Relationships came and went, some filled with passion, others with comfort, but none touched that quiet center the way Keanu did. She didn't compare him to others consciously, but the contrast existed all the same. With him, she never felt the need to perform love. It simply existed, steady and undemanding. Keanu, meanwhile, carried her presence with him wherever he went. Friends noticed it in small ways, the way he mentioned her casually in conversation, the way he smiled at certain memories, the way her perspective seemed to shape his own. To those close to him, it was clear she mattered deeply, even if the nature of that connection remained undefined. One evening while traveling abroad, Keanu sent her a simple message. "Saw the ocean today. Thought of you." It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it made her pause, her heart tightening with something that felt like longing and gratitude all at once. She replied just as simply, "Same ocean, same sky." They never elaborated, and they didn't need to. The truth was becoming clearer to both of them, even if they never spoke it aloud. What they shared had survived years not because it lacked depth, but because it had it. Because it wasn't built on urgency or expectation, but on mutual care and understanding. Sandra sometimes wondered what it would have been like if they had tried, if they had crossed that invisible line and turned their bond into something the world could label. But every time she imagined it, the image felt smaller than what they already had, like forcing something vast into a narrow frame. As she lay awake one night, listening to the distant sounds of the city, she realized something that both comforted and unsettled her. Love didn't always ask for more. Sometimes it simply asked to be respected. And maybe that was what they had been doing all along, honoring something too meaningful to rush, too fragile to risk, and too real to ever disappear. By the time dawn broke, Sandra felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Whatever the world believed, whatever questions remained unanswered, she knew this much. What existed between her and Keanu was not a story of missed chances. It was a story of deliberate choices, of two people who understood that the deepest connections don't always need a future to validate their past. And as the light filled her room, she wondered, not for the first time, whether the greatest love of her life was the one that never demanded to be anything more than it already was. The weight of what was never said. Sandra Bullock began to notice that memory had its own gravity. It didn't pull her backward, but inward, drawing her attention to moments that had once felt ordinary and now revealed themselves as pivotal. The older she became, the more she understood that the most defining experiences in life were rarely announced when they happened. They arrived quietly, disguised as routine, as friendship, as conversations that ended without conclusions. And at the center of so many of those moments stood Keanu Reeves, steady, unassuming, and deeply woven into the fabric of her emotional life. As years layered themselves gently on top of one another, Sandra found herself moving through the world with a growing sense of reflection. Success had brought her everything she once believed she wanted: recognition, security, influence. Yet with each achievement came an unexpected stillness, a sense that the loud victories mattered less than the quiet connections that endured. When interviews asked about happiness, she spoke about balance, about gratitude, about choosing peace. What she didn't say, but felt constantly, was that peace had a face, a voice, a presence she had known for decades. Their lives continued to intersect in subtle ways. Sometimes it was a shared event, sometimes a mutual friend, sometimes nothing more than a coincidence that felt intentional. They didn't plan these moments. They seemed to find each other naturally, as if the world itself nudged them back into the same orbit whenever distance grew too wide. And each time they met, Sandra sensed the same thing: nothing between them had faded. If anything, it had deepened, grown more thoughtful, more restrained, more aware of its own fragility. There was an afternoon when they met for a walk along the coast, the ocean stretching endlessly beside them. The wind carried the scent of salt and memory, waves rolling in with patient rhythm. They walked slowly, hands tucked into their pockets, letting the sound of the water fill the spaces between their words. Sandra spoke about a film she was considering directing, one that explored grief not as an ending but as a transformation. Keanu listened closely, nodding, asking questions that showed he understood the heart of what she was trying to say. "You always choose stories about healing," he observed quietly. She smiled, not denying it, because healing is the hardest thing to do honestly. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. "You do it without pretending it's easy." That was how he always saw her, not as the world did, not as a symbol of strength or success, but as someone who faced pain directly, without spectacle. And in that understanding, Sandra felt seen in a way she rarely did anywhere else. As they continued walking, a question pressed against her thoughts, one she had carried for years but never voiced. It wasn't about regret. It wasn't even about desire. It was about truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but vulnerable. "Do you ever feel like we've been holding our breath for a very long time?" Keanu slowed his pace slightly. He didn't look at her right away, but she could sense the weight of her words settling into him. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I also think some breaths are meant to be held." His answer lingered with her long after they parted that day. It suggested intention rather than fear, choice rather than avoidance. Yet Sandra couldn't ignore the ache beneath it, because holding one's breath, no matter how deliberate, still meant waiting. In quieter moments, alone with her thoughts, she revisited their history with new clarity. She saw how often they had stood at the edge of something deeper and chosen to step back, not out of indifference but out of care. They had watched each other build lives, form relationships, experience loss. They had been present without intruding, supportive without demanding. It was a rare kind of discipline, one born from respect rather than restraint. Yet there were nights when that discipline felt heavy. Nights when Sandra wondered whether love was meant to be so carefully managed, whether protection sometimes became its own form of distance. She thought about the times she'd wanted to reach for him, to say what lingered unspoken, and had stopped herself because the risk felt too great. Losing him, even as a friend, had always seemed unimaginable. Keanu carried similar thoughts. Friends noticed that he grew quieter after spending time with her, more introspective. He rarely spoke about her directly, but when he did, it was with a gentleness that revealed how deeply she mattered. He described her not in terms of admiration, but understanding. "She reminds me to slow down," he once said softly, "to be present." That presence became especially meaningful during moments of uncertainty. When Sandra faced a professional setback, one of the rare times public opinion turned harsh, Keanu was the first to reach out. Not with advice, not with reassurance about reputation or resilience, but with something simpler. "You don't have to prove anything," he told her. "You never did." Those words settled into her like a quiet promise. They weren't romantic in the way the world expected romance to sound. They were better. They were grounding. As time passed, Sandra began to recognize a truth she had avoided for years. Love didn't always demand resolution. Some connections existed to teach, to steady, to remind us of who we were beneath everything else. And perhaps that was the purpose of theirs. Not to culminate in a ceremony or a label, but to endure as a constant in lives otherwise marked by change. Still, endurance came at a cost. There were moments when she felt the weight of all they had never said pressing against her chest. Moments when she wondered whether honesty might have led them somewhere else, somewhere equally beautiful but different. She didn't resent the past choices, she simply acknowledged their complexity. One evening, as she watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Sandra felt both peace and longing coexist within her. She realized then that love could be both complete and incomplete at the same time, whole in its presence yet unfinished in expression. What she and Keanu shared lived in that paradox. A connection strong enough to last decades, gentle enough to never demand more than it was given. And as the stars began to appear, Sandra accepted a quiet truth. Some loves are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be carried, carefully, respectfully, and forever remembered for what they were, not what they could have been. The courage to let it remain. Sandra Bullock had reached a stage in her life where noise no longer impressed her. The applause faded faster now, interviews felt repetitive, and even success carried a quieter echo than it once had. What stayed, what truly stayed, were moments of stillness, the kind that asked nothing of her except honesty. It was in those moments that she understood how deeply certain people had shaped her, not through grand gestures but through constancy. And among them, Keanu Reeves remained the most enduring presence. Like a familiar shoreline she always knew how to find, even in the dark. As the years progressed, their lives moved in parallel rhythms. Sometimes they drew close, sometimes they drifted apart, but never far enough to lose sight of one another. Sandra noticed that when she was at her calmest, when her choices felt most aligned with who she truly was, Keanu was often somewhere in the background, offering perspective, listening without judgment, reminding her through his quiet example that gentleness was not weakness. Their connection had matured into something neither of them tried to define anymore. Labels felt unnecessary, even intrusive. What mattered was trust. There came a period when Sandra took on projects that demanded more from her than she expected, emotionally and physically. Directing forced her to confront her own doubts, to lead while remaining vulnerable, to face criticism without losing compassion. During those months, Keanu checked in often, never prying, never demanding explanations. Sometimes his messages were brief, almost deceptively simple, but they carried weight. He had a way of reminding her that she didn't need to harden herself to survive, that her instinct to care, to remain open, was not something to outgrow. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she called him without planning to. The call stretched late into the night, moving from laughter to reflection, from shared memories to unspoken understanding. At one point, Sandra found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing on the other end of the line and feeling something settle inside her. It wasn't longing in the way she once understood it. It was acceptance. Acceptance of the fact that some connections don't demand progression to be meaningful. They simply exist, complete as they are. Keanu, for his part, had grown increasingly introspective with age. He spoke less publicly, chose his projects carefully, and guarded his inner life with quiet intention. Those close to him noticed that when he spoke about values, kindness, patience, humility, he did so not as ideals but as lived experiences. Sandra was woven into many of those reflections, even when her name wasn't spoken. She represented a chapter of his life defined not by romance or regret, but by understanding. There was a moment during a private gathering far from the spotlight when someone asked him directly whether he ever wished things had turned out differently. The question wasn't meant to provoke, but it lingered in the air longer than expected. Keanu paused, thoughtful as always, then answered calmly. "Some things don't need to be different to be meaningful," he said. "They need to be honored for what they are." Sandra wasn't there to hear it, but when the words eventually reached her, they felt like a mirror of her own thoughts. They met again months later, not by design but by chance, in a quiet place neither of them frequented often anymore. Time had softened their faces but not their ease with one another. Conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by shared humor and reflective pauses. At one point, Sandra found herself laughing at something he said, the sound surprising her with its lightness. It struck her then that with him, joy had never felt forced. It had always arrived gently, without conditions. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation drifted toward the future, not in terms of plans, but perspective. They spoke about aging, about what it meant to remain kind in a world that often rewarded hardness. Sandra admitted that she had learned to value peace over certainty, depth over intensity. Keanu nodded, understanding fully. "Intensity fades," he said quietly. "Depth stays." That sentence stayed with her long after they parted. It explained so much about why their bond had endured while others had not. What they shared wasn't fueled by urgency or fear of loss. It was built on patience, on the willingness to let things unfold without forcing them into shape. In the weeks that followed, Sandra reflected on the idea of courage, not the kind that pushes forward, but the kind that knows when to stop. It took courage to admit love without demanding it take a specific form. It took courage to let something meaningful remain undefined, trusting that its value didn't depend on public recognition or personal validation. She realized then that their story was not one of hesitation, but of choice. A choice to protect something rare by refusing to rush it, to preserve a connection that thrived in honesty rather than expectation. And in making that choice, they had given each other something lasting, a safe place to return to, no matter how far life carried them. As Sandra watched the evening settle into night, she felt a quiet gratitude rise within her. Whatever the world believed about her and Keanu, whatever narratives people constructed, she knew the truth. Their bond had never been about what they lacked. It had been about what they shared, a depth of understanding that didn't need to prove itself, a love strong enough to remain gentle, and a mutual respect that allowed them to let it remain exactly as it was. The quiet choice that defined everything. Sandra Bullock had always believed that life revealed its deepest truths slowly, not in moments of chaos, but in stretches of calm where reflection became unavoidable. By the time she reached this chapter of her life, she understood that clarity often arrived after years of living with unanswered questions. And one of those questions, perhaps the most persistent, was no longer why things had unfolded the way they did with Keanu Reeves, but how something so quiet had managed to shape her entire understanding of love. There came a season when Sandra deliberately stepped back from the noise of Hollywood. Not a disappearance, not a retreat, but a conscious narrowing of her world. She spent more time at home, more time choosing projects that felt honest rather than impressive. In that stillness, she noticed how often her thoughts returned to Keanu, not with longing, but with appreciation. He had been present at the most emotionally formative points of her life, even when the rest of the world moved too fast to notice. During one particularly reflective period, she found herself rereading old journals she had kept over the years. They weren't dramatic or poetic, just fragments of thoughts written late at night. His name appeared more often than she expected, not as a romantic ideal, but as a reference point. Talked to Kay tonight, felt calmer, saw something beautiful today, wished Kay was there. These entries made something painfully clear. He had been her emotional anchor, the quiet place her mind returned to when everything else felt uncertain. Meanwhile, Keanu was experiencing a similar reckoning. As the years passed, he became more selective, not just about work, but about people. Loss had taught him that presence was precious and finite. In moments of solitude, he thought about the few individuals who had never asked him to be anything other than himself. Sandra was always at the center of that small circle. Their conversations, sporadic but sincere, remained a source of grounding. She challenged him without pressure, supported him without expectations. One evening, after months of not seeing each other, they met again, quietly, intentionally. No event had brought them together. No coincidence had intervened. One of them simply reached out, and the other answered without hesitation. They sat across from each other in a familiar place, the kind where time felt slower, insulated from the world. The conversation moved naturally, but beneath it lay a shared awareness that this meeting mattered. At one point, Sandra spoke with a candor she hadn't allowed herself before. She admitted that she had once believed love had to lead somewhere tangible to be real. That commitment meant progression, escalation, proof. She smiled softly as she said it, acknowledging how much her thinking had changed. "I don't believe that anymore," she confessed. "I think love can be a constant without being a destination." Keanu listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he responded, his voice carried the weight of someone who had reached a similar conclusion on his own. He spoke about how society often confuses intensity with depth, how quiet bonds are dismissed because they don't announce themselves. "Some things endure precisely because they aren't tested by expectation," he said. "They're allowed to remain honest." That honesty hung between them, unforced and undeniable. It wasn't a confession of feelings, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was the recognition that they had both made the same quiet choice years ago, to protect something meaningful rather than consume it. As the night drew on, they reminisced not with nostalgia but with gratitude. They spoke about moments that could have gone differently, choices that might have led to another version of their lives. There was no bitterness in these reflections, only understanding. They acknowledged that timing, fear, and care had all played roles, not as obstacles but as guides. Sandra realized then that the love she shared with Keanu had taught her how to let go without loss. It had shown her that connection doesn't weaken when it isn't claimed. It strengthens when it's respected. She had never felt owned by him, and she had never tried to own him. That freedom had allowed their bond to breathe, to evolve without breaking. When they finally parted that night, there was no sense of closure, but also no sense of unfinished business. They embraced briefly, warmly, like two people who understood exactly what they meant to each other. As Sandra walked away, she felt a calm certainty settle within her. She no longer wondered what might have been. She knew what was, and that knowledge felt complete. In the days that followed, she reflected on how easily the world misunderstood stories like theirs. How people searched for endings when some narratives were never meant to conclude. What she and Keanu shared wasn't a romance delayed or denied. It was a choice, made again and again, to value depth over definition, presence over possession. And as Sandra moved forward, she carried that choice with her, confident in the knowledge that some loves don't need to be lived out loud to last forever. A love that chose to last without a name. Sandra Bullock no longer searched her past for answers, because time had given her something gentler and far more enduring than explanations: understanding. The years had taught her that the deepest truths rarely announce themselves with certainty. They settle quietly, like light at the end of a long day, revealing what has always been there. And as she looked back, not with longing, not with regret, but with clarity, she saw how one connection had shaped her sense of love more profoundly than any other, not by what it demanded, but by what it never asked for. By now, the world's questions no longer unsettled her. Interviews still tried to trace her life in simple lines, to identify milestones that could be neatly summarized. Marriage, permanence, endings, these were the measures people understood. But Sandra had learned that fulfillment was not a checklist. It was a feeling of alignment, of peace that followed you home when the lights went out and the noise faded. And when she listened carefully to that peace, it always echoed with the same quiet presence she had known for decades. Keanu Reeves had reached his own understanding in parallel, shaped by loss, humility, and an unwavering commitment to kindness. He moved through the world without urgency now, choosing presence over ambition, meaning over momentum. Those who knew him well could sense that his emotional life was anchored by something steady, something untouched by time. Sandra was not a chapter he revisited with nostalgia. She was a constant reference point, a reminder of who he was when he stripped away performance and expectation. Their conversations, though less frequent than in earlier years, had grown richer. When they spoke, there was no catching up to do, no need to explain absences. They spoke as if no time had passed at all, because emotionally it hadn't. They shared observations about life, about aging, about the subtle courage it took to remain open in a world that rewarded detachment. In those moments, Sandra realized that what they had cultivated was not a paused romance, but a living bond, one that matured as they did, adapting without losing its essence. There came a day when Sandra was asked, privately and sincerely, whether she believed in soulmates. The question lingered with her long after it was asked. She considered how the word was often used to describe destiny, possession, or a singular romantic outcome. And yet what came to her mind was quieter, more nuanced. She thought of someone who had known her across versions of herself, who had witnessed her growth without needing to guide it, who had stayed close without holding on. She realized then that if soulmates existed, they were not defined by permanence in form, but by permanence in care. Keanu once spoke to her about something similar, though he framed it differently. He said that the most meaningful relationships in his life were the ones that taught him how to be gentle with himself. Sandra understood immediately. Their bond had never pushed them to become something else. It had allowed them to remain who they were. That, she realized, was the rarest gift one person could give another. As time continued its steady movement forward, Sandra found peace in knowing that her life had been shaped by a love that did not end, because it never needed to begin in the way the world expected. It had existed alongside everything else, careers, relationships, changes, without diminishing or demanding. It had survived precisely because it was never tested by ownership or fear. When people spoke of missed chances, Sandra no longer felt the urge to correct them. She understood that from the outside, her story with Keanu might look incomplete, but from within, it felt whole. It had taught her how to recognize love without urgency, how to value connection without condition, how to let something meaningful remain exactly as it was without trying to make it smaller by defining it. In the quiet moments of her life now, early mornings, long drives, evenings spent in reflection, Sandra felt gratitude rather than doubt. She had loved deeply, and she had been loved in return in a way that did not fade or fracture with time. It was a love that chose to last without a name, to remain present without promise, to endure not because it was claimed, but because it was respected. And in that understanding, she finally saw the truth that had always been there. Not every great love story is meant to be told in chapters the world recognizes. Some are written in silence, in constancy, and in the quiet decision, made again and again, to let love be exactly what it is and nothing less.